Good evening to you. Thank you, Jeff. May I say how good it is to be among you. Thank you for the welcome. May I begin with a prayer for clarity of heart. Clear our heart, O God, that we may see Thee. Clear our heart, O God, that we may truly see ourselves. Clear our heart, that we may know the sacredness of this moment, and in every moment seek Thee, serve Thee, as the living presence in every presence. Clear our heart, O God, that we may see. Amen. Religion without borders. This, I believe, is part of laying the foundations for peacemaking in our world. I approach this subject as I approach nearly every subject in my life and in my writings and teachings, and that is by returning to what is perhaps the most cherished image in the Celtic world from which I draw so heavily in my life. It is the image that is cherished in the Celtic world, the image of John the Beloved leaning against Jesus at the Last Supper. And in the Celtic world, it was said that he therefore heard the heartbeat of God, and he became a symbol of the practice of listening deep within ourselves, listening deep within one another, listening within the body of the earth for the beat of the sacred presence. And tonight I invite us especially to be listening deep within the wisdom of traditions, spiritual traditions, other than the traditions of our own birth. And to see this journey of traveling to the heart of one another's great spiritual wisdoms as part of laying the groundwork for real transformation in our world and among us as nations. Tonight I'm going to be looking at one of the great prophets of this journey to the heart of another wisdom tradition, a great prophet in our Christian household, Bede Griffiths, an English Benedictine monk who spent most of his life in India. And I invite us to allow his journey to be a lens through which we look at our own journey. In his case, it was a journey to the east and into the heart of Hinduism. It may be in ours, in our local communities and in our realm of contacts and relationships. It may be a journey towards the heart of Islam, or towards the heart of Judaism or Buddhism, or towards the heart of native wisdom in this land. Bede Griffiths spoke about journeying to India as a journey to discover the other half of his soul. And even before he went to India, he spoke of going as a pilgrim. What might the history of Christianity look like if we had journeyed as pilgrims towards the heart of the wisdom of other great traditions? Many years ago, I was giving a talk in Ottawa, in Canada, on some of the themes of the prologue to John's Gospel, and especially the words, "the true light that enlightens every person coming into the world." In attendance at the talk was a Mohawk elder who had been invited in part to be there to make observation about any of the parallels between his First Nations spirituality and the Celtic spirituality that I was drawing heavily on for the talk. At the end of the talk, this Mohawk elder stood with tears in his eyes and said, "As I have been listening to the themes tonight, I have been wondering where my people would be tonight. I've been wondering where I would be tonight. I've been wondering where we would be as a Western world tonight if the mission that had come to us from Europe centuries ago had come expecting to find light." We cannot undo the horrific wrongs that have been done in the name of the truly humble one, Jesus. We cannot undo our history as a Christian household of perhaps being the most arrogant form of religious expression, conquering, triumphing in the name of truth. We can, however, be part of a new birthing. And I believe one of the major characteristics of this birthing will be a radical humility in which we see true humility of spirit as our greatest strength of true relationship. Before Bede went to India, he was aware as a young Benedictine monk, this was in the mid-20th century, he was aware of what he called the fossilization of much Christianity, how it had got stuck or fixed in form doctrinally, liturgically, and in so much of its belief structure. And he was aware that the very nature of the universe is that the universe is forever unfolding, forever finding its new form, new expression. So something that is not unfolding is finished in the universe. He was a son of the Christian household, but as a prophet, he didn't shy away from naming the rot within his inheritance. So he didn't shy away from speaking of rottenness within his own religion. But one of his favorite mantras was, "But there are seeds in the rotten apple. There are seeds in the rotten apple." And I believe that if we are yearning for real transformation and change in our nation and in our world, we need to keep our eye on the seeds that we have received in our various religious inheritances. Thomas Berry, the eco-theologian, who preferred to, instead of calling himself a theologian, he liked to call himself a geologian, because the sacredness of the earth was right at the heart of his vision and teachings. Thomas Berry used two phrases that I find helpful in reflecting on the life and unfolding of a religious tradition. He speaks of the micro phase of a religious tradition and its macro phase. By micro phase, he is referring to the early stages in the development of a religion, when a religion is just finding its charism or its particular wisdom for humanity. And in that early stage, it's like a young sapling that's just emerging from the ground. And early on, in the microphase of a religion, that young sapling, that young growth, maybe needs a fence around it in order to protect the young thing. And in its microphase, it's primarily those who come within the fence that receive blessing. When a tradition grows up, however, he said, when, in the case of Christianity, when we grow into the maturity of our Christhood, a religion in its macrophase can offer its blessings freely, way beyond any boundaries that have been set around it. Think of the maturity of Hinduism, for instance, and how it is blessing the whole world at the moment with a single phrase. Namaste. N-A-M-A-S-T. The sacred in me bows to the sacred in you. The divine in me honors the divine in you. This phrase is becoming common parlance around the Western world. Hinduism doesn't require us to become Hindus in order to use this phrase of spiritual honoring of one another. Similarly, in our Christian inheritance, we have so much treasure to offer, so much Jesus wisdom about the way of nonviolence, for instance, that we can give away, not on the condition, well, you need to come within our four walls. You need to access this wisdom through our sacraments or through our doctrinal propositions. We have treasure. Let us learn from our different traditions to know how to give it away with grace, with generosity. It was in the early 1960s that Bede Griffiths arrived at Shantivanam, the Benedictine monastic community in Tamil Nadu that styled itself as an Indian ashram. And there he led what he called the marriage of East and West. And that is also the title of one of his greatest publications. That marriage of East and West expressed itself in their daily rhythm. At morning prayer, they would hear readings from the Hindu Vedas, from the Quran, from the Hebrew Scriptures, from Christian Scripture. Their meditative practices accessed the simple and ancient wisdom of the East. After communion every morning, those who participated would receive the bindi on the forehead, the symbol of inner wisdom. To partake in communion was to know the wisdom of the Christhood that is deep within our nature. This was not syncretism on the part of Bede. This was belief in marriage. One of his principles, guiding principles, is that true union differentiates. Who are the people with whom we know the deepest of unions and the most intimate of union in our lives? These are the people who have the power through love to set us radically free. Union is not about uniformity. It's not about conformity. It's a union that knows radical differentiation as part of its path. In my experience of working closely with teachers from other wisdom traditions, I know that what they are looking for me to be true to is Jesus. They're not wanting me to somehow hide my treasure, the treasure of my household. They're wanting me to speak of the wisdom of Jesus for this moment in time. And often they look at us, that is the Christian household, with total perplexity. Why are we not doing what Jesus told us to do? Why are we not loving our enemy? Why are we not looking for the sacred at the heart of the so-called enemy? They're perplexed. They think, do we know something that Jesus didn't know? Do we think he was naive? Let's look at part of what the East and the West bring in their dowries to this marriage. The West is strong in its sense of the transcendence of the sacred, and in that sense, the aboveness or the beyondness of the sacred. The East, on the other hand, has always been very aware of the withinness of the sacred, the immanence of the sacred. We, of course, in our Christian household have great teachers like Meister Eckhart in the 14th century who knew both and taught both. He says God is both unnameable and omni-nameable. On the one hand, there is no name that can be uttered. On the other hand, everything is essentially an expression, a manifestation of the one. Jeff here is a manifestation of the divine, a manifestation that will never be again. Each one of you. You've come into this world because the world needs you. The world needs the manifestation of the divine that is wonderfully, uniquely at the heart of each one of you. In Scotland, we had a wonderful Jesuit priest named Jerry Hughes. Some of you may have come across his writings. He wrote a great book called God of Surprises. But at conferences, when people were introducing themselves, Jerry would stand up and he'd say, "Hello, I'm Jerry, a unique manifestation of the divine." I love the way in India how generally as a culture, it is still a culture that is very alert to the spiritual. And in so many conversations, even casual conversations on train journeys, people will often dive deep pretty early on philosophical and spiritual conversation. During one of my first visits to India, I was in Bangalore, and we delicate Westerners sometimes find the onslaught of the senses in India too much for us, sound, color, scent. And it was my custom most days in Bangalore to seek a bit of refuge from that constant bombardment of the senses in the Lal Bagh Gardens at the heart of Bangalore. And the day I'm remembering was an occasion when, as I was seated on a bench in the Lal Bagh Gardens, an elderly Indian gentleman who turned out to be a retired Indian banker strolled up to me and said namaste, and we began a conversation, and after a few pleasantries, he, with a gentle wagging of his head, said, "I have one question for you." He said, "Who are you?" And I sensed he wasn't asking me what my name was, but I thought, well, I'm going to feel my way into this conversation. So I said, "I'm John Philip." He said, "I was not asking you what your name was. I was asking, who are you?" So I said, "I come from the same one you come from." And that pleased him well enough to move deeper, and over the next number of minutes, he gave me a type of synopsis of Hindu wisdom and spoke of the self within all selves, the life within all life. And then he said, "I must be going now, but I have one final thing to say to you." He said, "You are God. And until you realize you are God, you will not be wise, you will not be happy, you will not be free. Namaste." Since then, I've been wondering when I'm going to have such a conversation in the Edinburgh Botanical Gardens with a retired Scottish banker, a retired Scottish Presbyterian banker. Well, how do we hear the wisdom of a gentleman like that. Because we have lived in such a divorce between East and West that we hardly know what he's talking about. And in the West, we have so defined ourselves in terms of our ego that we are in danger of thinking that he was addressing my ego. Emphatically not. One only has to scratch the surface of Eastern wisdom to know that we only access our of-godness through a journey of dissolving the way in which the ego tries to be the center. This is not to put down the ego, this divine faculty of consciousness and willpower, but it is to say that the ego is not the center of our being, but the ego is given that we may serve the true center, the soul within our soul, the self within all selves, the life, the light within all light. And this is part of what we owe one another in our communities of spiritual practice, ways of consciously and with great strength dissolving the ego's attempt to be the center. And I speak not just of our individual journeys, but of our national journeys. Think of the enormous ego of our nation at times, or our religious egos. Think of the enormous ego of Christianity. How do we do this work of dissolving in order that we may truly serve the light, the soul, the life at the heart of one another and all things? Let's look at other gifts in the dowry that are brought to this marriage. The West has a sense of the permanence of the physical. Yes, at one level, of course, we know it's passing, but we tend to live as if the physical has a type of permanence of reality. The East, on the other hand, has a very strong sense of the impermanence of the physical. Everything is passing. And the term that's often used is the Sanskrit term Maya, M-A-Y-A. It's often incorrectly translated unreality, and I believe it means much more essentially impermanent. Everything is passing, and in that sense doesn't have ultimate reality. But one of the very interesting things and important things, I believe, to pay attention to in how the East uses this word is that Maya, impermanence, is used to refer also to religion. Isn't that a good idea? Because we sometimes forget that, of course, the doctrines, the rituals, the practices, the belief structures exist to point beyond themselves, not as ends in themselves. A number of years ago, I was giving a sermon at St. Giles Cathedral in Scotland, our little national cathedral in Edinburgh. And the center of St. Giles Cathedral is one of my favorite ecclesiastical places in the whole world. 4 massive pillars, about 1,000 years old, and the pulpit hugs one of these pillars. So I began the sermon on that occasion by saying, there will come a time when this building is no more. And there will come a time when our scriptures are no more. And there will come a time when Christianity is no more. That was too much for one of my hearers. And she shouted out, heresy. That, of course, is when the rest of the congregation woke up. I could see people looking around as if to say, did he say something? I mean, we really need one of those every Sunday. And this woman was furious, and she was in one of the traditional Scottish boxed pews. So in order to get out, she slammed the door open at the end of the pew, and she had power dressed that day, good hard heels pounding down the central aisle. And when she got to the main west door, she opened it, and before slamming it, it was no longer heresy now, it was heretic, and slammed the door. There has been a tendency to absolutize our religion. And when Christianity does that, in my experience, it is no longer a road sign. It has become a stop sign, or it has pretended it's the destination. I've just come from a weekend retreat in New Mexico called Faiths Finding Faith in Each Other. One of the great gifts of teaching in the high desert of New Mexico over many years has been the opportunity to teach with leaders, teachers of other wisdom traditions. And one in particular is like a brother to my soul, Rabbi Nachum Ward-Lev from Santa Fe. The first time we taught together, I heard Nachum say to some of our participants, he said, now when John Philip teaches, it comes out Christian, but it goes in Jewish. I agree. When Nachum teaches Torah, he feeds my devotion to Jesus. So how do we do that for one another? We've been so trained to think that our traditions are exclusive. Absurd. I mean, is religion an exception to the universe? We know the interrelatedness of all things. We know how everything relates and depends on each other. So Nachum and I have had many summers of teaching together, but I'm remembering an occasion from a few summers ago in which we were teaching in separate classes, and the class that I was working with on that occasion, on that morning, was looking at that beautiful Easter story from John's Gospel, in which Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb of Jesus and finds that the stone has been rolled away. And she is standing in the garden weeping because she believes that the body of her beloved one has been stolen. And the risen Christ in the story appears in the garden, and there's a beautiful dialogue. And in the dialogue, Jesus says, "Do not hold me. I'm going to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. Do not hold me." And as we were reflecting on this passage, I kept thinking of Nachum, and I realized that I wanted to speak to him about this passage. And what I thought I was wanting to share with him was a sort of theological observation that Christianity has tried to hold Jesus. He's not ours. He was born a Jew. He lived a Jew. He died a faithful Jew. He's not ours. If anything, he belongs to the world. How do we serve him in that role? How do we bring his wisdom without calling other people to somehow have to enter our four walls? So I thought I must speak to Rabbi Nachum about this, and I'll look out for him at lunch. And we ended up in the same line in the cafeteria and picked up our food, and I asked if we could share lunch together. We took our food out onto a picnic table outside the dining hall and sat down. But when I began to speak, I started to weep. And I realized this is not a theological observation. And I realized I was in the middle of a spiritual confession. And I had to ask his forgiveness and the forgiveness of his tradition for how my tradition has tried to hold Jesus. All these traditions are passing, and all great teachers know they are passing. Think of the amount of time given in John's Gospel to Jesus speaking about the coming Spirit, who would do in them what the Spirit had done in him. Maybe the least preached upon text in our Christian household is that passage in John's Gospel when Jesus says, "Those who come after me will do greater things than I." Do we believe this? I believe this is the language of love. This is how we speak about our children. This is how we speak about those whom we most love, that we want even greater things for them. I first went to India in 1990 at the invitation and gift of Harry Underhill, who was the nephew of the great English mystic Evelyn Underhill. And Harry saw, I was on the island of Iona at that stage leading the Abbey community, and he saw that the Iona community and I could do with some exposure to the East. I had never been. I very swiftly accepted his invitation. I was quite excited to go to India, but another part of me felt quite anxious, quite nervous about entering India. I had been trained theologically at one of the most prestigious places of philosophical theology in the Western world, the University of Edinburgh, where we thought we knew it all. All up here. And of course, I had been trained in not one way, but the heart, and not at all in meditative practice. I was more than 21 at that stage, but I had about me what G.K. Chesterton calls the towering infallibility of 21. So I was somewhat nervous about going to India. Was this interior world of spirituality not subjective delusion? Because truth, of course, was exterior, it was dispensed, rather than a well to be forever accessed in new way and unfolding ways. So I had some anxiety going to India, and my anxiety became pretty clear on the first night, in which I had a dream. In the dream, I was drinking vodka with Mikhail Gorbachev, as one does in one's dreams. My wife tells me I have a very inflated dream ego. So in the dream, I was knocking back shots of vodka with my good friend Mikhail. And at the end of the third glass, in the dream, I discovered a chemical residue. And in the dream, I thought, I'm being drugged. And I woke up, and even though in those years I didn't pay very close attention to my dreams, even to me, it was clear that I was having some anxiety about being drugged or deluded. Now, Mikhail Gorbachev is not exactly an Eastern guru, but this was February 1990. This was 2 months after the Berlin Wall fell. Gorbachev was at the height of his revolution of glasnost, openness, perestroika, being restructured. I was being invited to be restructured through openness, through relationship with the East. Harry and I arrived at Shantivanam, the Bede Griffiths ashram, late at night, so I hadn't yet seen the lay of the land under the sun's light. But when we were being shown to our monastic cells, we were told that we would hear a bell before the rising of the sun, and that would be announcing morning meditation down by the river Calvary. So on hearing the bell, I got up. It was still dark, but I just followed the padding of footsteps towards the river. And by the time we got to the river, there was that sort of pre-dawn suggestion of light enough for me to be able to see some of the monks in their saffron-colored garbs, some Indian villagers from nearby, sort of hunkered down on the river bank, arms around their knees, waiting for the rising of the sun, as they have been doing since time immemorial, this ancient spiritual practice of waiting for the coming of the light. And I could see that there were some Westerners there as well from their attire. Standing in that pre-dawn light, I had, I think, one of the most important awarenesses of my life, and that it was, I do not have a clue what to do in meditation. Highly trained. I didn't have a clue. Not the simplest way of accessing what to do in meditative prayer. That realization led me to having a conversation with one of the wise old monks of Shantivanam that afternoon. And he chose to teach me possibly the simplest and most ancient way of Eastern meditation, a simple repetition of the first word, Om, which in the Eastern traditions is seen as the first sound, or the first word through which everything has come into being. Very similar to what we hear at the beginning of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word, in the beginning was Om, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and everything has come into being through the Word. Everything is sounded into being. Everything carries the vibration of the divine. So the old monk invited me, first of all, just to be aware of the rhythm of my breathing, and how when we breathe in, our body lifts up slightly, and when we breathe out, our body settles slightly in a downward movement. And he invited me to allow my breathing just to be the rhythm of the mantric repetition. And he suggested that I say Om on the down breath or on the downward movement, addressing that first sound or energy deep within us. And in the upward breath to breathe up and allow that sound of the divine, that vibration of the divine that is at the heart of our being, to come up into fuller consciousness, awareness. So simple. And it's been the staple diet of my prayer for nearly 30 years. When I came back to the West, though, quite early on, I realized I wanted to weave this Eastern wisdom into my own inheritance. So instead of always saying Om, I found I would often use a phrase from the book of Psalms, "You are my strength," and breathe up from that true strength that is deeper than my ego. Or I found I wanted sometimes to Christianize or to baptize the practice, and I found that words close to the heart of Jesus' mantric teaching, die in order to live, die to live. So to live from those true depths that are deeper than our ego. Some of you know that my daughter, Kirsten, my second daughter, has spent many years in India. And she spent 5 years at a dance ashram in Chennai, Kalakshetra, which was founded in part under the influence of Gandhi during the approach to Indian independence, realizing that true nationhood is about building on the spiritual foundations and art forms of a nation. Kirsten had been a dancer since she was knee-high. My earliest memories of her as a little girl are of her dancing, leaping off the ground. And then, of course, was trained in Western dance and ballet, which, of course, is primarily a type of transcendent dance, sort of reaching up, leaving the ground. And in India, the form of sacred dance that she was learning, Bharatanatyam, is flat-footed, bent-kneed, pounding the earth to release the sacred from deep within, this the immanent sense of the sacred. So in her case, it was her body that led her intuitively to find the other half. I would say about Kirsten what Bede said about himself, and that is he journeyed to India to find the other half of his soul. In Kirsten's case, however, I would say that she didn't know the first half of her soul yet. It was only in India, through the sacred dance of Hinduism, that she accessed the first half of her soul, or Christian half of her soul. Why should we be surprised about that? What do these great teachers, spiritual presences in our world, like the Dalai Lama and Thich Nhat Hanh, what do they say to those of us from the West who look to Buddhism for wisdom and for practice? Of course, they let us share their wisdom, but they say, go back. Go back and look deep in your own inheritance. Find the treasure there. I loved visiting Kirsten at the dance ashram because every morning they would gather for prayer around a great banyan tree, sacred tree at the very heart of the ashram. You know, this tree with intertwining trunk system, and then its branches stretch out, and every 25 feet or so they dive back into the ground to do secondary rooting, and that way the tree becomes an enormous and strong tree, a place of sanctuary. An image of what our religion can be. Strong central trunk, but with branches that can reach out and do a type of secondary rooting to access wisdom of other traditions. But every morning these about 50 beautiful young women, primarily Indian, would come in their colorful saris, and about 25 beautiful young men in their colorful kurtas would come and sit on the ground, and they would chant words from the Vedas, from the Hebrew scriptures, from the Christian scriptures, from the Quran. But this central trunk, strong central trunk of the banyan tree with its secondary rooting system, struck me so powerfully as an image of what we're being invited to do, to become truly strong as a tradition. I was sharing this image with a group sometime after I had experienced morning prayer at Kalakshetra. And there was a woman from Florida in the group, and she, at the end of the talk, explained to me that in her town in Florida, at one stage, they had great banyans all along the central boulevard, and that the town council decided that they really needed to tidy up the banyan trees. So they cut all the secondary roots. And when the next storm came in, all the banyan were knocked over. I would say in our Christian household that we are in the midst of a storm, a very uncertain time about how we are going to find our form to carry great blessing. But we will be not stronger by cutting secondary roots. We will make ourselves much weaker by refusing to be pilgrims, journeying towards the heart of other great wisdom traditions to be strengthened in our Christhood. I'm going to make some time, allow some time now for hearing from one another. But before we do that, I invite us into a simple meditative practice so that we approach the heart, so that we move into that equipoise between head and heart, so that when we do begin to share from one another, we're not just operating from up here, but we're paying attention also to what's been stirring at a deep level within us as we've been reflecting together. So I'm going to play a recording of a chant that, a series of chants that I've worked on with some Scottish musicians, in which we use words from the Quran, words from the Hebrew Scriptures, words from the teachings of Jesus, to pray especially around themes of peacemaking. And the words that I'm suggesting we use tonight in this chant are from the Quran. The words we'll be singing in English are based on the Quranic text. The words in English are, whichever way you turn, there is the face of God. Whichever way you turn, there is the face of God. You'll hear an Arabic descant running through the chant. The words that you'll be hearing are Ya Basir, which is the face is everywhere, or the eyes are everywhere, the eyes of the divine. But we'll be singing the English phrase, whichever way you turn, there's the face of God. There are a couple of instrumental interludes in the chant, during which we can just in silence allow the words to continue to sound. And when the lyrics come back in, I invite you to join the chant. Please join it as soon as you become familiar with it. It runs for about 6 minutes.
Whichever